In this eighth and final video lecture, we will learn about qualitative research, mixed methods research, and action research. Before we get into those though, we first need to look at a research question that we're going to be exploring with qualitative research, mixed methods research, and then action research. The question is, what factors are associated with readmission rates for psychosis at an inpatient psychiatric unit? Part 1 explores qualitative research. It would first help to differentiate quantitative from qualitative research. Thus far, in this video series, we have exclusively looked at quantitative research, which is the assessment or analysis of numbers using statistics, usually to prove whether our hypothesis is correct or incorrect. Qualitative research, on the other hand, does not rely on numbers. Instead, it tends to incorporate words and language a lot more. So, for example, you may conduct a series of interviews and then maybe analyzing the interviews for themes across the interviews. Qualitative research can be a better fit for the research questions than quantitative research when a researcher lacks a hypothesis, a researcher has a small sample size, or when the researcher wants to know more about a phenomenon rather than evaluate it. I'll give you an example. End-of-life experiences. We don't know a lot about that, or at least not as much as we could know. And perhaps it would be helpful to understand that phenomenon a bit more before we start asking people to put numbers to that phenomenon, if that makes sense. In some ways, qualitative research is a better fit for counseling than quantitative research. This is because qualitative research explores depth rather than breadth. Remember that statistics, the goal of statistics really, in quantitative research, is to make a generalization from a sample to a population. So you take the results of a sample and your end goal is to say, well, whether or not this is going to be represented in the population if we did the same study with everybody. And therefore your findings are useful outside of the study. Well, qualitative research isn't concerned as much with generalization. Instead, it's more interested in understanding the depth of a phenomenon. Going back to end-of-life experiences, instead of knowing or trying to know, does everyone have a similar end-of-life experience, for example? We're more interested in what are those end-of-life experiences like for different people and how does it impact them. And instead of trying to make generalizations, we just try to go deeper to understand. Qualitative research tends to give participants a voice in the research just because it relies so heavily on words in comparison to numbers. And that can be very powerful and important, particularly when you're doing a research study into a sensitive area, say a person's experience with racial microaggressions, or even a person's experience with end-of-life issues, or those kinds of topics can engender a lot of emotions, and so giving participants a voice into that can be quite important. Counseling tends to be a good fit with qualitative research for a final reason, and that's because interviewing in qualitative research and interviewing in counseling are quite similar. They require similar skill sets. The ability to listen, to ask follow-up questions that are thoughtful, that move the conversation along. And so because of that, counselors tend to like and favor qualitative research, especially if they aren't necessarily in favor or gifted with math ability. A frequent criticism of qualitative research is that it has the inability for findings to demonstrate effectiveness, meaning it's quite difficult with qualitative research to say that A caused B, to demonstrate causation because we don't have control groups or randomization in qualitative research, really. And in addition to that, we're not using statistics to test out whether or not a finding is likely to happen by chance alone. So effectiveness studies aren't a good fit for qualitative research. And in addition, there is a difficulty with generalizing qualitative research to other people or populations. And we'd mentioned that qualitative research really isn't focused on that, but it is also a limitation because if you're conducting a study and you know at the end of the study that it's not going to have broader reaches, broader impacts necessarily, then it's just a limitation of the study. Okay, so qualitative research is conducted using what's known as the inductive process, whereas quantitative research involves the deductive process. The inductive process in qualitative research is about exploring something, a phenomenon, a topic, without pre-existing expectations or hypotheses, trying to go into a topic with a not-knowing stance. In contrast, quantitative research uses a deductive process. Before you conduct the study, you are meant to, usually, have some kind of a hypothesis about what you think is going to happen. And the study becomes about determining whether pre-existing expectations and hypotheses were accurate or not. So in the inductive process, you enter with no sense of knowing, with a not knowing stance, and in quantitative research, in the deductive process, you intentionally enter with pre-existing expectations, with a knowing stance, if you will. Okay. So another really important part of qualitative research is bracketing. In qualitative and mixed method studies, the researcher's expectations and hypotheses become biases to be bracketed. In other words, hypotheses are not useful to qualitative research because they tend to get in the way of the data. We tend to see what we think we're going to see. So in qualitative research, you are very open about all of the possible biases you may hold as a researcher, and then trying your best to not allow them impact the kinds of data you would be collecting in the study. So researchers bracket their biases, and bracketing is the term used to mitigate or alleviate or reduce to the extent possible the impact of your biases by doing the following: writing out what they expect to happen before conducting the study, trying to minimize the potential for these what are known as a priori or before the fact assumptions influence data collection. And here's a good example of this. Researchers try to avoid asking leading questions during qualitative interviews. So researchers will avoid asking questions that have a strong bias. Going back to our research question, a researcher doing a qualitative study would want to avoid a question such as, how strong do you think the relationship is between income level and readmission rates to the hospital? Asking this question, while it may sound innocent if you look a bit deeper, this question is grounded in bias, because if you look at the question, essentially the assumption is that income level impacts readmission rates, and the question is about how strong it impacts readmission rates. There's already an assumption that it does impact readmission rates. So the assumptions within a question indicate biases and are something to be quite mindful of when you're doing qualitative research. Qualitative research is a separate discipline from quantitative research and has its own designs and approaches. The main designs of qualitative research are phenomenology, grounded theory, narrative, ethnography, and case study. Let's look at phenomenology first. Phenomenology is the in-depth study of a few cases seeking to understand the essence of an experience. For example, going back to our prior research question about why people are getting readmitted to a psychiatric facility, if we were doing a phenomenological study, we might examine just the process of being admitted to a psychiatric unit. What is that like? What does a person go through? How might that impact, if at all, future readmission? Grounded theory is the most rigorous form of qualitative research. It uses a coding approach called the constant comparative method, and we'll watch a video on this in a moment. Grounded theory has the goal of generating theory from data in an inductive fashion. In other words, the goal is to create theory based on the data rather than test theory based on pre-existing notions of what really is occurring. So, if you are conducting a grounded theory study into that research question, you might develop a theory for what causes some people to be readmitted based on the data that you gather from, say, interviews with people who are readmitted. Here's a video that provides an example of the constant comparative method. I like this video. It contains jelly beans. It's a good example of how the constant comparative method works. I think this video is a wonderful example of how qualitative research works, a visual example. You begin with all of this data, all of these words, and you try to start grouping them into similar categories. So you saw at the beginning you had 3 groups, and the colors in each of the categories were obviously different, but there was also a lack of really definition within the group. So you'd have black, but also a green color within the same group. And after a while, that with more and more data, as you accumulate more data, the groups become more numerous. You start getting 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 groups, and they become more defined, meaning they only have that color. They don't incorporate different colors into the same group. And so after a while, with more and more data, you reach what is called saturation or redundancy. That's when essentially you don't need to include any more data into the study because you already have some pretty well-defined groups. And that's how qualitative research works, especially using the constant comparative method from grounded theory. And I'll add that the constant comparative method is used commonly in a lot of other forms of qualitative research, even outside of grounded theory. It's just a very popular way of coding data. Narrative qualitative research usually is an examination of story by comparing stories against one another. So, using our example, in narrative research, we would compare life stories of people who are readmitted to the hospital. We would want people to tell their life stories to us and then compare them to try to understand why readmissions occur. Ethnography was of course made famous by Jane Goodall's experience among apes. Ethnography is when a person enters a new and unfamiliar culture to gain an understanding of it as an outsider. So, for example, if a person was doing an ethnographic study with our research question, they would go through the admission process as a patient, a pseudo-patient themselves, to better understand that. You can tell here that the role of the researcher or investigator is quite important in ethnographic research because they journal and speak to their own experiences of entering into a new and unfamiliar climate as an observer of it. Case studies are the most common form of qualitative research. There are two main forms of case study. The first is a single case study, which could involve a single person, or a single organization, or a single site. So, for example, looking at factors causing readmission rates at just one hospital, and gathering data from multiple sources usually, so the people working there, the patients, their files, in terms of what causes readmission rates. And then a multiple case study involves multiple people, multiple organizations, or multiple sites. So, for example, we may look at factors causing readmission rates at 2 hospitals and then compare them to try to understand what's going on to cause readmission rates, what's similar and what's different. In addition to qualitative research, there is a third research paradigm, quantitative, qualitative, and also mixed methods research. Mixed methods research is used when questions cannot be answered by quantitative or qualitative data alone. We need both. Over time, the last decade or so, mixed methods has emerged as its own paradigm within research studies, with its own designs. We're not going to go through all of the mixed methods designs today, but you can buy or read textbooks that talk about these different mixed methods designs, and they really are quite neat and useful in terms of being able to integrate quantitative numerical data with qualitative verbal or word kinds of data, what I would call ideographic data. Very useful, usually because when you're using qualitative data, it can be useful to explain what's going on with the numbers. You can explain that better so you have a better sense of what the numbers actually mean. So we looked at qualitative designs and mixed method designs and qualitative research in general. Now we're going to look at action research, which is a particular framework of conducting research and can use quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods designs. To understand action research, we have to first understand positioning. Positioning is about how previous knowledge or exposure to the setting of the study can affect the researcher's biases and how participants respond in the study. There are two types of positioning, emic and etic positioning. By definition, action researchers have emic positioning, as we will find out. And you'll see why participants may respond differently in the study based on emic or etic positioning. Let's look at emic positioning first. This is known as insider status within a setting or organization. So, in our earlier example, a researcher has emic positioning if they are working in the hospital where the study is conducted. Now, this would impact the kinds of responses you would get from people, let's say the staff or the patients, because they may know you and have a prior existing relationship with you. And it's that prior knowledge that's going to impact the kinds of information they give you. Maybe they'll trust you more and be more open. Or maybe they'll be more cautious because they don't know what you're going to do with the information, or maybe you have a negative history with them or whatever. But your prior exposure to the setting matters, and that's why we look at positioning in quite a lot of detail when we're doing qualitative and mixed method studies. Etic positioning is outsider status within a setting or organization. So, in our example, it would be when the researcher has etic positioning if they have never worked at the hospital where the study is conducted. Almost like Jane Goodall going out into the wild and meeting up with the apes. Doing something that is completely outside of your typical setting. So I'd mentioned that action research uses what's known as emic positioning. This is because action research is all about research conducted in real-world settings by the people providing the services themselves. This is often called naturalistic research. In action research, the researcher is already actively involved in the setting, usually they work there, for example, rather than a passive observer or an external investigator. Action research can be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method. I'd mentioned that. The type of design is just going to depend on the research question you have and the types of data that you are gathering. But it's important to remember that with action research, the researcher works in the setting and, as we'll find out in the next slide, has the intention to make changes based on the data that they are gathering. Kurt Lewin is considered to be the father of action research in a lot of ways, and his philosophy or theory was that we have to change the system to study it. And if you think about what that means, in order to really understand what it's like to work somewhere, to really understand a topic, a phenomenon, we have to mess around with it a bit. We have to change it. And usually to do that, we have to be on the inside. And that's why action research can be quite powerful, and it also requires emic positioning. So we've reached the review. Today we learned about qualitative research, mixed methods research, and action research. This concludes the 8th and final video lecture.